and welcome to another episode of Conversing on Africa's Peace, a monthly podcast focused on the African Union's Peace and Security Council and key related issues, produced as a collaboration between the Australian Embassy in Addis Ababa and Amani Africa Research and Media Services. My name's Adam, it's good to be with you. Today I'm very pleased to be joined once again by Amani's Director of Programs, Miss Betania Tades. Great to see you, Betania. How are you going?
Great to see you, Adam. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Yeah, same to you. Very much so. And to all our listeners. We took a break from the podcast over Christmas and the New Year, but we're back in business. The New Year is upon us and Addis is heating up, literally and figuratively. If we look at the African Union, the Permanent Representatives Council has been considering its agenda over the last week or so, and the Executive Council and the General Assembly, otherwise known as the AU Summit, are both coming up fast. This is Addis's summit season. Of course, the Peace and Security Council's work continues throughout this busy period, and it will consider some extremely interesting agenda items this month, which we will examine in due course. But first, Betania, let's take a quick look back at last month, January. Uganda stood in for Senegal as chair for the month of January. Can you explain why that was? And then, from your perspective, what were some of the highlights from the month of January?
Yes, Adam. So once again, thank you for having me, and it's really great to be back for the new year. As you rightly pointed out, absolutely January was a very interesting month in terms of when we look at the working methods, for example, of the PSC. We had, the scheduled chair for the month of January was Senegal. It was supposed to be Senegal, but there was change in the order, and we had Uganda chairing the PSC for the month of January. And obviously the month of January and February is a busy month for the chair of the African Union, which is Senegal. Yeah. So understandably, chairing the AU and in addition to that the PSC was going to be very hectic for Senegal. So if you see it from that perspective, it really is important to have a different chair for the time being.
No, that makes sense.
Absolutely. And having a standing chair, it's not necessarily like a very common practice. It's something that we have witnessed, for example, back in 2020. But it's just to ensure that there is continuity of the PSC when the chair is not able to take on the role.
Okay, that makes sense. And then, turning to my second question, pick out your highlights for the month of January, if you like.
Absolutely. So January, Uganda being the standing chair, what that entails is holding more of a statutory kind of meetings, declaring emergency sessions, emergency situations that the PSC needs to deliberate on. So that is what Uganda did as a stand-in chair. It's mainly focused on the preparatory work of the PSC reports, its activities report, but also the state of peace and security report that would be submitted and presented to the Assembly for the upcoming session of the AU Summit. Okay. So that is really what the main work focused on in January. But of course, in addition to that, one important report that was considered in January is the half-year report on elections.
Elections, yeah.
Yes. So this is part of the standing agenda item of the PSC. So every 6 months there is a presentation, a briefing that is presented to the PSC on elections. So the recently concluded session that was held in January really looked at the elections that were conducted between the period of July and December 2022, and it also provided a bit of overview of the upcoming elections in the next 6 months in this 2023.
And we know that every year in Africa, one way or the other, there are dozens of elections, be it at local, state or federal level. So always so much interest and commentary on those election issues. So by the sounds of it, it was actually quite a good use of the PSC's time in January to go through some of those more administrative matters, which then freed up Senegal to turn its attention directly onto summit season, as we've explained. So it was probably a good compromise or a good rearrangement of the normal setup.
Yeah, absolutely, because we will have Uganda chairing as usual in May 2023, so it will have its slots.
Okay, so that's January. Now let's turn our attention to the month ahead. It's going to be a big month, as I sort of touched upon in the introduction. South Africa is the PSC chair for February, and it will convene 5 sessions, as far as we know at this stage, 4 country-specific sessions and 1 thematic session. Looking at your excellent, as usual, forward-looking analysis for the month, I can see we'll have some really interesting meetings in terms of the level they're pitched at. We have the ministerial level meeting. Also, interestingly, a heads of state and government level meeting, and 3 at ambassadorial level. Now, as you say in your analysis, according to Ambassador Edward Kolisa Makaya, permanent representative of South Africa to the AU, the focus of the program on the month on specific conflict situations is seeking to inject some urgency into the resolution of these situations, which I think is really interesting. And I also understand there'll be 2 field missions and a meeting of the PSC Military Staff Committee. Before we get into any of the detail on those matters, any initial impressions of the overall agenda for the month?
Yes, as you rightly mentioned, South Africa, for its chairship in February, really deliberately focused on country-specific conflict and crisis situations, but also in terms of not only the kind of crisis situations that is considering, but also in terms of covering the different regions in the continent.
Right.
As we've also highlighted in our analysis, in terms of the selection of this crisis, it's really representative to a large extent of the various crises happening over the across the continent. Mainly from the North African region, we have Libya. In East Africa, we have Sudan, also South Sudan, and also from the Central Africa region, DRC, which is also currently a very, very timely issue that is being considered by the PSC.
And I guess that's good for the membership, right? The member states to see that the PSC does have that continent-wide gaze and is aware of what's happening in the different regions, which seems to me like a really important message to send.
Absolutely. That's also in line with the PSC mandate, because it has a continental mandate, so it's very important to address all the issues that are, the security issues that are affecting the continent, but also if you see the level as well, one ministerial and one heads of state and government level session really signals also the kind of importance South Africa attaches to those in terms of addressing those specific conflict and crisis situations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. Okay, so the month's agenda starts looking north, from Addis anyway, with a session dedicated to the situation in Libya on the 1st of February. Libya was last considered by the PSC in June 22, and it seems, unfortunately, that the peace and security situation has not markedly improved there since then. What do you imagine will be discussed in that first session?
Libya will be discussed as the first agenda item of the month under South Africa's chairship. It will be held tomorrow, 1st of February. And this session is also taking place at a very, it's taking place at a very critical time. If you see it from very different perspectives. One, given the political, but also the security developments happening in Libya taking place, but also, the kind of deteriorating security situations, particularly following the delayed election, which was originally supposed to take place in December 2021, and that delayed election also had a bit of had an impact in terms of creating more rivalry between the two governments. One, the Tripoli-based, but also the Eastern-based government, which was particularly the tension was further heightened due to the delayed election as well. There have been, of course, a number of efforts, particularly the UN, trying to mediate and trying to provide a bit of political support in terms of addressing this challenge. And one element, of course, is the unification of the two governments. The other one is, agreeing on a roadmap in terms of holding the delayed elections. And to have that, to even have the preparation for the election, one important aspect is the process leading up to the drafting of the constitution. So, of course, all these processes have faced a lot of challenges, but one opportunity is the appointment of special representative of the UN Secretary General.
Okay.
So that presents a lot of opportunity, of course, for the African Union to also re-engage in the situation in Libya. And that is particularly important, that the point about the AU having a more active role in Libya.
Right.
If you see the agenda of the PSC, as you mentioned earlier, Libya was only considered, for example, once by the PSC in 2022. So there needs to be a much more, engagement, more frequent meetings, and more frequent discussions on the African Union side, but also utilizing mechanisms that have been set up to support the Libya transition and the overall political process, including the high-level committee, of course, the contact group that has been established by the AU. There needs to be a more revival and more utilization of these instruments and these mechanisms, and of course in coordination with the UN as well, to have a more of a harmonized response to the crisis in Libya.
Okay, well, a big start to the month and really serious issues under the microscope, and we wish the PSC well with that session. On the 3rd of February, the first of 2 field missions for the month, the PSC will undertake a field mission to Mekelle in Tigray, Ethiopia. There have been other AU visits under the auspices of the High Representative for the Horn of Africa, President Olusegun Obasanjo, of course, but this is the first time the PSC has been to the city for a long time, particularly since the cessation of hostilities. Is it noteworthy that the visit is happening while South Africa is the PSC chair?
Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely a correlation there, given the role South Africa played in the signing of the peace agreement between the warring parties in Ethiopia, and now that is chairing the PSC. It's very important to also have this field visit to Mekelle in the Tigray region, to also express solidarity to the people, but also to accompany the process. So it's very interesting that this is also happening at this time, but also an important factor that we also need to note is the fact that this is the first PSC visit in the region since the outbreak actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Back in November 2020.
Yeah, we'll watch with great interest, and we look forward to hearing how that field visit goes. On the same day, excuse me, the Military Staff Committee will meet to discuss the status of AU peace support operations. Can you briefly explain what this is about and why this might be a timely meeting?
So this session is taking place, there have been a number of consultations around AU support operations when it comes to the financing bit, but also when it comes to we have a number of ad hoc coalitions in the continent at the moment. And the implication of this ad hoc coalitions to the operationalization of the African Standby Force, and what does that mean for this continental mechanism. So there have been various consultations led by the African Union Commission. So now this is taking place to continue this discussion, but also to also discuss the financing bit aspect as well, because we have different kind of processes happening on the financing. There is particularly when it comes to the partnership with the UN for AU-led peace support operations, being able to access UN-assessed contributions. So that is one component which the African Union has also been pushing for. So there are different pieces, and this is also trying to bring all those elements together as well. Okay,
that makes sense. I guess incremental progress is still progress, and so we wish them well with their deliberations on that matter. Moving on to the 6th of February, this will be held at ministerial level and will consider the key developments in Sudan since the last PSC session on that country, notably looking at the agreement signed on the 5th of December 2022. What can we expect to come out of that meeting, Britannia?
So this meeting, again, it's one of those important sessions which, if we look at 2022 again, there hasn't been any kind of a regular session on the PSC, so it's good that it's happening, and it's good it's happening at the ministerial level. So it's a very high-level meeting. Of course, the framework agreement that was signed between civilian organizations, political parties, and the military, that's an important development within the country. But of course the talks are still ongoing. There was an agreement that was signed, but in terms of the details of the agreement, particularly when it comes to the transition, including the formation of a civilian government, security sector reform, but also when it comes to accountability aspects, those talks are still taking place. So it will be very important to also how those talks also evolve and what kind of outcome we'll have from those talks. But an important factor, again, in this discussion is, of course, the membership of Sudan, which was suspended back in 2021.
Do we expect any movement on that, or it'll just be kind of considered and maybe put to one side while other matters are considered?
Well, that really depends.
It's hard to say, I guess.
A lot of factors, and how things will progress in Sudan as well. There are a set of number of requirements of course, that need to be fulfilled.
I see. Okay. Right. Looking ahead, so on the 8th of February, the session then will have 2 agenda items. A briefing, which I'm interested to hear about, by the Committee of Intelligence and Security Services of Africa on the continent's peace and security outlook for 2023. We'll talk about the other item in a second, but tell me about this first briefing. It sounds very interesting.
So the CISA briefing to the PSC really forms part of the quarterly briefing that the PSC receives on continental early warning and security outlook. So this happens every quarter, like in February, in June, October, and then in December finally. So this is just to enhance and also support the PSC in undertaking its early warning and preventive diplomacy. Of course, in this context, there are other pillars of APSA that also undertake a similar mandate like that. So this is part of, the activity of the PSC, something that is also outlined in its annual indicative program of activities, and it's really aimed at supporting the preventive and early warning mandate of the PSC.
Is it any different because it's the February edition? Like, is there a look ahead, or is there a nod to informing anything at the summit, or it's just like it sticks to its quarterly agenda of reporting?
So this is just a standing agenda. It's not necessarily associated with the summit, but more of like delivering this quarterly kind of briefings, on the major security, peace and security trends in the continent.
All right, and the second item is focused on the African Peer Review Mechanism's African Governance Report for 2023. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about this report and what it's for?
So the African Peer Review Mechanism has been collaborating with the Peace and Security Council, particularly in terms of providing briefings, but also presenting at various PSC sessions, like as we've witnessed in 2022. This is also because of this increased interlinkage between security issues and governance issues, and with the rise of unconstitutional change of government, and also also because, given this year's report of the APRM will focus on the unconstitutional change of government, the 2023 report. Yeah. So it really makes sense. It's a very organic partnership between these two AU bodies to have that deliberation.
Right. Now we're moving through the month and we're moving into the summit season proper. This is a big one. On Friday, the 17th of February, the PSC will convene at heads of state and government level in person here in Addis Ababa to consider the situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. We note with concern the recent deterioration of the situation there, and I just want to know why this session is so important and what you think will be considered there.
So the session on the situation in Eastern DRC will be held, of course, at the heads of state and government level, and it's absolutely important that the session will also take place at that level, at the highest level. And I think it's very good that South Africa was also able to utilize the convening around the AU summit, the presence of African leaders and partners in February here in Addis, and to have that meeting on Eastern DRC. So the Eastern DRC security situation, as we have witnessed in recent even days, there is increasing kind of tension, and it's no longer like an Eastern DRC issue, but it has increasingly becoming more of a regional.
Sure.
It's increasingly assuming a regional dimension.
Yeah, of course.
Following the increasing allegation against Rwanda, but also what is taking place in terms of the diplomatic rifts between the two countries, Rwanda and DRC. So in terms of mediating or addressing this political and security situations, there have been a number of efforts by the African Union and regional leaders as well, both on the political and the security track. The Nairobi process and the Luanda process are, the ones that are also very much prominent in this in this respect. The military track of the Nairobi process has resulted in the deployment of a force in Eastern DRC, the East Africa Force. Yeah. And of course, the political track has resulted in the appointment of President Kenyatta to mediate between the government of DRC and the various armed groups that are operating in Eastern DRC. And on the other hand, we have the launch of the Luanda process by Angola, and the president of Angola was actually mandated by the AU Assembly, by the Extraordinary Summit, to also mediate between Rwanda and the DRC.
Right.
So those are like a number of efforts that were taking place in the past month, which will also, of course, feature very prominently, a bit of updates and briefing from the various actors that are leading on the different processes. And of course, recently we've also witnessed efforts from Qatar to convene summits between Rwanda and DRC, which did not necessarily materialize. But what we are seeing is the actual deterioration and even like a military kind of confrontation between the two countries. So this heads of state and government level session on Eastern DRC cannot come,
soon enough.
Yes.
Yeah, no. Really interesting, and I think you framed the issues very well. And for the sake of the ordinary people of DRC, we hope some progress is made by all that high-level interest and attention on the situation there. Before the month ends, we're not quite finished yet. We've got a couple of sessions to go. The second field mission will be underway from the 23rd to the 25th of February. I understand it will visit South Sudan as a solidarity visit, as it's described, as decided during the 1123rd session of the PSC. What is the purpose, generally speaking, of that field mission for you?
So this field mission to South Sudan, constitutes as one of the standing agenda items. Something that the PSC has also indicated already that it will undertake a field mission in February.
Right.
It's also indicated in its annual indicative program of activities for the year, and also follows the PSC decision that was already made last year. So the main objective was, of course, to assess, the remaining tasks in relation to the transition to the transitional period, particularly after the extension of the period for another 2 years. So it was supposed to be completed this year in February, but there is an extension of another 2 years. So it will be very important for the PSC to also assess what the next 2 years will be for South Sudan, and what kind of steps have been taken so far, and what remains to be done, and what kind of support South Sudan also requires to complete the transition period.
Okay. In direct connection to that, the final PSC session for the month, scheduled for the 28th of February, is focused on South Sudan. My understanding is that we will receive an update on the implementation of the 2018 agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan, and the 2022 roadmap of outstanding issues.
Exactly. So the time of considering this report is also very much important, as it comes right after the conclusion of the field mission, which also demonstrates the urgency, which we have made reference in our insights on the program of work, which we have quoted Ambassador of South Africa, Ambassador Makaya, really the urgency of the PSC. Right after the conclusion of this field mission, it will consider the report so that it can provide better political guidance to the country as well. Yeah,
I'm sure it's, as you say, really timely, and South Sudan really needs support from institutions like the African Union to stabilise and to build a lasting peace. So we wish it well. Wow, another big month here in February in Addis. I know the Executive Council and summit agendas are still being finalised, but from your perspective, or from Amani's perspective, do you have any predictions on any elements of those upcoming meetings which might particularly focus on peace and security issues of interest to our listeners?
Well, the summit that is taking place this year, the 2023, the year itself has been, declared as the year of accelerating implementation towards African Free Trade Area.
Indeed.
So it's going to be the year of ACFTA. So a lot of discussion will, of course, focus on this particular theme. But maybe just to, when it comes to the peace and security aspect, particularly, of course, in addition to the activities that will be presented to the Assembly, which are the standing agenda items. But this session on DRC will receive a lot of attention.
Right.
Also because, this year, the year 2023, in February, particularly, also marks the 10th anniversary of the Peace and Security and Cooperation Framework for the DRC.
Okay.
So it's really interesting to have, the revival of that framework as well, because, it's actually very much relevant given the current situation in DRC and the Great Lakes region at large. So we really will follow closely on this particular session.
Maybe it's too early for you to tell me, but is Amani planning anything special to coincide with summit season? Any events, or are you unable to sort of announce finalised plans just yet? Tell me you're planning something, even if you have to keep it secret.
No, absolutely, of course, make it public. But of course, we have a number of engagements, but absolutely, we will keep everyone informed of our upcoming activities around the summits.
You're like all the key players in this town, you're keeping your cards close to your chest, but we look forward to whatever it is that you have planned, just as we look forward to the Executive Council, the Summit, and all those other interesting side events that will no doubt take place. All the very best to South Africa as it chairs the PSC in February, and of course all the best to everybody taking part in all the high-level AU meetings in February. It's a really interesting time to be working on multilateral issues here in the capital of African diplomacy. We hope this podcast continues to provide an accessible way to understand the PSC and its work. Betania, thanks so much for joining me today and for sharing your insights with us. Before we go, as usual, we'd like to wish the following African states happy National Days of celebration. For February, we have the Gambia on the 18th of February and Egypt on the 28th of February. We wish you all peace and prosperity.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for joining us for this month Conversing on Africa's Peace podcast, which is a collaboration between Amani Africa and the Australian Embassy in Addis. And really, I look forward for the next session as well.